October 12, 1964. The Pitsunda Dacha, a government retreat pressed against the northeastern edge of the Black Sea. The water that morning was flat and colorless, the kind of calm that feels less like peace and more like held breath. Nikita Khrushchev stood on the terrace in a loose shirt, a glass of mineral water in his hand, watching a fishing boat drag a slow white line across the horizon. He was 70 years old. He had survived Stalin. He had survived Beria. He had survived the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Wall, the U-2 spy plane disaster, and 11 years of governing the most volatile empire on Earth. He had done things that would have destroyed lesser men and emerged each time louder and more impossible than before. He believed with the absolute conviction of a man who has never been successfully beaten that he was still untouchable. The phone rang. It was a secure line, a heavy black receiver connected directly to the Kremlin through an encrypted channel that only the most senior members of the Soviet government could access. Khrushchev picked it up. The voice on the other end belonged to Mikhail Suslov. Suslov was the Communist Party's chief ideologist, a skeletal, bloodless man so devoid of warmth that his colleagues privately called him the Gray Cardinal. He did not make small talk. He did not ask about the weather on the Black Sea. "Nikita Sergeyevich," Suslov said, his voice arriving like a document being stamped. "An urgent session of the Presidium has been convened. We need you to return to Moscow. There are matters regarding agricultural policy that require your immediate attention." Khrushchev said nothing for a moment. The breeze off the water touched the back of his neck and felt, suddenly, like a blade. He had spent 3 decades inside the Soviet system. He had learned its language the way a man learns the language of a country where the wrong word gets you shot. And the specific combination of words Suslov had just used, urgent session, agricultural policy, immediate return, was not a policy discussion. It was not a scheduling request. It was a syntax he recognized from the Stalin years. It was the polite, bureaucratic vocabulary of liquidation. "Agriculture," Khrushchev repeated. "Yes," Suslov said. "Agriculture." Khrushchev set the receiver down slowly. He turned to his aides. The color had left his face completely, replaced by something that the aides would later describe not as fear exactly, but as recognition, the expression of a man who has just seen a trap he built himself being used against him. "That's it," he said quietly. "They're coming for me." To understand why the entire Soviet elite turned on Nikita Khrushchev in a single coordinated movement, why men he had personally promoted, personally protected, personally elevated from obscurity, rose against him in unified and absolute silence, you have to understand what Khrushchev had done to the system that created him. In February 1956, Khrushchev stood before the 20th Party Congress and delivered what became known as the secret speech. It was 4 hours long. It was not broadcast. The doors were closed and guarded, but what happened inside that room sent a shockwave through every layer of Soviet society that was still reverberating 8 years later. When Suslov made his phone call, Khrushchev named Stalin. He described the purges. He listed the executions of innocent men. He acknowledged the Gulag. He dismantled, with deliberate and methodical precision, the founding mythology of the Soviet state, the idea that the party was infallible, that its leadership was guided by scientific truth, that every death had been necessary and correct. He did this because he believed it was the right thing to do. He also did it because exposing Stalin's crimes was the most effective way of neutralizing his rivals, most of whom had participated in those crimes, and now lived in terror that the files would surface. But in doing it, he committed an error so catastrophic that it would take 8 years to fully detonate. He told the men at the top of the Soviet system that the top of the Soviet system could be wrong. He told the Politburo that the Politburo had committed atrocities. He told the party apparatus that the party apparatus had been an instrument of murder. He abolished the fear that held everything together, and without fear, the men who ran the Soviet Union began, for the first time in 30 years, to think for themselves. What they thought about was Nikita Khrushchev. The grievances were not invented. They were real, they were deep, and by 1964 they had accumulated into something structural. The military despised him. The generals, men who had survived Stalingrad, Kursk, and Berlin, men who wore their medals like a second skeleton, watched Khrushchev with a contempt so intense it had become a physical condition. He had slashed the defense budget. He had declared that nuclear missiles made conventional armies obsolete, and then forced the retirement of hundreds of thousands of career officers without adequate pensions, without ceremony, without acknowledgement of what they had given. He had dropped them onto the street like surplus equipment. Then came Cuba. The generals did not see the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 as a moment of masterful de-escalation. They saw a leader who had placed nuclear missiles 90 miles from Florida, provoked the most dangerous confrontation in human history, and then removed those missiles under American pressure, while the whole world watched. Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, the defense minister, told colleagues in private meetings that Khrushchev had made the Red Army look like a paper tiger. That phrase circulated through the military establishment for 2 years like a slow-burning fuse. The party bureaucracy had its own wounds. Khrushchev governed through improvisation. He woke up each morning convinced he had solved a problem that hadn't existed the day before. He reorganized the party structure in 1962, splitting it into separate industrial and agricultural branches, creating an administrative catastrophe so severe that regional party officials literally did not know who their superiors were or which chain of command they belonged to. Men who had spent careers building carefully positioned authority found their entire institutional architecture dismantled overnight by a decree they learned about in Pravda on a Tuesday morning. And then there was the land. Khrushchev's Virgin Lands campaign, his grand project to transform the arid steppes of Kazakhstan into a grain-producing powerhouse, had become a national embarrassment of staggering proportions. The topsoil, thin and fragile, and entirely unsuited for intensive agriculture, had turned to dust. The harvests collapsed. By 1963, the Soviet Union was secretly purchasing grain from the United States and Canada, importing food from the capitalist enemy to prevent bread lines from becoming bread riots. The humiliation was total, but the grievance that unified every faction, military, bureaucratic, ideological, was simpler and more primal than any of those. Khrushchev fired people constantly, randomly, enthusiastically. He reorganized ministries while they were running. He replaced ministers who had done nothing wrong because he had read an interesting article and decided their entire field needed new leadership. He created an atmosphere in which no position, no matter how senior, carried any security whatsoever. The Soviet elite, the nomenklatura, the class of privileged administrators who ran the empire, wanted one thing above everything else: not revolution, not glory, not the expansion of communism to the far corners of the earth. They wanted to know that when they went to sleep on Tuesday night, they would still have their job on Wednesday morning. Khrushchev could not give them that. He was constitutionally incapable of it. Leonid Brezhnev could, and Leonid Brezhnev knew it. Brezhnev had been Khrushchev's loyal subordinate for years. He was physically impressive, broad-shouldered, heavy-browed, famously expressive, and socially gifted in the specific way that Soviet politics rewarded. He could drink with generals, flatter ideologues, and make exhausted bureaucrats feel that their contributions had been seen and valued. He was not a visionary. He had no transformative agenda. He made no speeches that anyone remembered. Khrushchev looked at Brezhnev and saw furniture. Useful, dependable, decorative furniture. He once told his inner circle that Leonid was a good man, but had no stomach for a real fight. It was the last serious misjudgment of Khrushchev's political life. Because while Khrushchev was banging his shoe and making threats at the United Nations, Brezhnev was doing something far more dangerous. He was listening. He was visiting. He was sitting in offices and hunting lodges and private dining rooms across Moscow, speaking quietly, making specific promises to specific people, and building brick by brick a coalition so broad and so quietly assembled that by the time it moved, it would be unmovable. He met with Alexander Shelepin and Vladimir Semichastny, the men who controlled the KGB. He told them that under his leadership, the security services would never again be publicly humiliated the way Khrushchev had humiliated them, their failures announced to the world, their operations exposed, their institutional dignity sacrificed for political theater. The KGB leadership listened carefully. He met with Marshal Malinovsky and the senior military command. He told them the defense cuts would stop. He told them their budgets would be restored. He told them they would never again be asked to watch Soviet missiles sail back to Russia While American warships held the line, the generals listened carefully. He met with the exhausted, frightened bureaucrats of the party apparatus, the men who managed grain allocations and industrial quotas and regional infrastructure, and he told them something so simple, it nearly broke them with relief. "No more reorganizations," he said. "Your positions are permanent. You will keep your dachas, you will keep your cars, you will keep your access, and I will never, under any circumstances, wake up on a Tuesday and decide that your entire ministry needs to be rebuilt from scratch." The nomenclatura listened carefully. By the time Khrushchev's plane touched down at Vnukovo Airport on the evening of October 13, 1964, every pillar of Soviet power had already made its decision. The army was with Brezhnev. The KGB was with Brezhnev. The party apparatus was with Brezhnev. The thing that looked like Khrushchev's government had, in the preceding months, become Brezhnev's government without a single shot being fired, without a single public statement, without a single moment that could be pointed to as the crossing of a line. The tarmac at Vnukovo was empty. No honor guard, no cameras, no red carpet, no limousines lined up with their engines running, and their doors held open by men in uniforms. Just Vladimir Semichastny, standing alone at the bottom of the aircraft stairs with his hands at his sides and his face arranged into an expression of absolute bureaucratic neutrality. Khrushchev came down the stairs and looked at the empty concrete and understood everything. "Where is my security detail?" he asked. "Your guards have been reassigned, Nikita Sergeyevich," Semichastny said. "Please get in the car." The meeting in the Presidium chamber lasted several hours. One by one, men that Khrushchev had raised from nothing, men who owed him their careers, their apartments, their access to the special stores where you could buy Western goods and decent meat, stood up and read from prepared statements. The statements had been written weeks in advance. They were calm, thorough, and devastating. "You are erratic. You govern by impulse. You have humiliated us internationally. You have destroyed our agriculture. You have treated the party as your personal laboratory." Khrushchev fought. He shouted. He reminded them who had saved them from Stalin's purges. He told them they were nothing without him, that he had pulled each of them out of the ground with his own hands. The room absorbed his fury without responding. Nobody raised their voice in return. Nobody defended him. Nobody made eye contact. They looked at their documents with the focused attention of men reading something very important and very distant. It was the silence that finished him, not the accusations. He could fight accusations. Not the betrayal. He had expected betrayal and had weapons against it. But the silence was something he had no tool for. The silence meant the decision was not being made. The silence meant the decision had already been made, weeks ago, in rooms he hadn't been invited to, by men he thought he owned. He looked at Brezhnev, who sat at the center of the long table with his hands folded and his face showing nothing. Not triumph, not guilt, not even the basic human acknowledgement that something significant was occurring. Just stillness. The stillness of a man who has already won and finds the formalities mildly tedious. "I'm old," Khrushchev said finally, his voice dropping into the quiet room like a stone into deep water. "I'm tired. Do what you want." He paused. "But you should know. The most important thing has been done. I abolished the fear." He was right, and it was precisely because he had abolished the fear that he was sitting in that room, instead of a basement cell. The men removing him from power were not going to shoot him. They were going to retire him. They were going to give him a dacha and a pension, and erase him from the public record, with the clean efficiency of a file being sealed rather than burned. Khrushchev had made the Soviet system just humane enough to survive his own removal from it. Brezhnev accepted the resignation without ceremony. Within 24 hours, Khrushchev's portraits were coming off walls across 11 time zones. His name was being removed from encyclopedias. His speeches were being reclassified and locked away. He spent the last 7 years of his life in a dacha outside Moscow, under quiet KGB surveillance, dictating his memoirs into a hidden recorder, not because anyone would listen, but because speaking the words was the only way left to prove he had existed. The coup that removed him produced exactly what Brezhnev promised: stability, order, security for the nomenclatura, no more Tuesday reorganizations, no more improvised agricultural disasters, no more international shoe-banging. And no more momentum, no more pressure, no more discomfort. The Soviet Union stopped being reformed on October 13, 1964. It kept moving, building missiles, expanding borders, printing slogans. But it had stopped going anywhere. The engine was running. The destination had been removed. What Brezhnev gave the Soviet elite was everything they asked for. What he took from them, without any of them understanding it at the time, was the only thing that could have saved them. The silence in that presidium chamber was not just the end of Khrushchev. It was the first full measure of the silence that would eventually swallow the entire empire. If this is the kind of history that gets under your skin, subscribe. It takes 3 seconds and it means more than you'd think. And leave a comment below. What aspect of this power struggle hit you hardest? I read every single one.